Good morning, everybody, and good evening for those of you who are in this part of the world. It's 6 p.m. in Canberra, and I think it's just gone 9 a.m. in the UK. So we're very pleased to have you from wherever you might be joining us. This is our second workshop. Today we're going to be talking about red teaming in biometrics. I want to thank all of you who were able to come to our launch a few months back. Since then, we've been very busy with a whole range of exciting things that are going on in the labs and certification world. There's a lot of very interesting things happening around identity frameworks and the connection between making sure that there's good assurance in the industry around performance of solutions. I'd like to remind you, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat box. We'll be delighted to answer them at the end of the session. And in addition, we will be we are recording this session. So if you have any, if you'd like to see the session again, or you'd like to refer the details on, there'll be an opportunity for you to be able to get a copy of the presentation as we give it today. The agenda for our workshop today is, first of all, to give you a brief overview and introduction to BixeLab, then to look at a red teaming and its how red teaming fits into the evaluation for biometric systems. I'll then be passing to Stuart, who will take you through why red teaming is important and its contrast to pad testing. Then we'll be able to give a live demonstration with Soumya of an actual red teaming attack optimization, and then to introduce our level R testing methodology, which kind of wraps up these red teaming activities. So BixeLab stands for Biometrics Identity Experience Evaluation, and it's been established to provide a range of different certification and assurance services to meet a growing need for trust and evaluation and certification in the biometrics and identity industry. And as we'd all be aware, there are lots of different aspects to that, from mobile phones through to eIDV, through to identity cases, mobile to border control, customer authentication. So there's a lot of different ways that biometrics are being used, and making sure that the biometric systems operate effectively is a key challenge for the industry as a whole. And that is what BixeLab is here to help, whether you are the provider of a biometric system or the user of a biometric system. Having a great understanding of how biometrics work and having that independent validation of that can be a huge advantage, both to your customers and to your internal stakeholders. So the journey of BixeLab really started with Biometrics over 20 years ago. Biometrics has been providing advisory and consulting services for all that time to a range of different clients. And part of those services had been providing evaluation, often for RFT type systems. But there was obviously a growing demand for formal laboratory testing, which had the backing of the formal credentials from NIST and from other credential bodies. And so in 2020, BixeLab was established. And then earlier this year, we achieved the NIST accreditation for our laboratory. As mentioned there, we're basically the only second laboratory in the world that's able to actually offer those set of biometric certifications. I'm delighted to have with me today our dedicated BixeLab team, who has a real depth of experience and knowledge and passion in this area. My name's Ted Dunstone, for those of you that don't know me already, and I've been involved with this area for, oh goodness me, more than 25 years in one way or another. And it's been my passion to understand and make sure that biometric systems are not just treated as black boxes, but that we really can get the best out of them and use them in a responsible way. With me, I have Stuart Pope, who's a senior advisor to BixeLab and has a lot of experience with both operational and technical evaluation of biometric systems. Laboratory manager Soumya Singh, who will be doing the demos later on, showing you some of those practical attack scenarios. Melinda Bartlett, who is our quality manager, and Matthew Butler and Sandy Ma, who are our laboratory technicians. As mentioned earlier, biometric systems come in all range of forms and from end consumer devices through to government applications, through to back-end algorithms. And each of those different products can be used in a range of different ways depending on the type of users that are required. Even today, there's a range of use cases in development contexts, in areas where it's important to be able to register people for health or for elections or even for refugee requirements. So all of those different systems can benefit from having independent testing to make sure that they are set up properly, that they're effective and they're useful, and particularly great when that can occur in proper laboratory settings with a proper, consistent, standardized methodology. So today for the workshop, we're talking about red teaming. And so red teaming is the idea that you are independently challenging some technology to see what sorts of attacks might penetrate and throw. So that's a simulated attack, essentially. And it often requires the team of people that are doing the red teaming to be able to think through creatively and optimize attacks. And the idea is to be able to specifically uncover the sorts of vulnerabilities, sorts of threats that might expose weaknesses within a system. And that's in contrast to a certain extent to the standard ISO testing. Stuart will mention this contrast in more detail later, which is more really focused around a very strict set of artifacts and attacks and measuring against those, not really optimizing or thinking outside the box to see what sorts of things might pose as security threats now or in the future. If you're looking holistically at a system that involves biometrics, there are actually a whole range of different risks that pop up, and they're not just in the algorithm. They exist in the security of the security model that the algorithm sits within. They can exist with the human factors in terms of how people, what sorts of people are using the system. They can exist in the management, even for instance for social engineering. So there are a whole range of different sorts of risks that impact on the vulnerability of a system. And some of those risks are more traditional IT related risks, and some of those risks are very specific to biometrics. When you've uncovered those risks, when you're doing these, the process of doing red teaming to identify what sorts of threats or attacks happen, you really need to be able to feed that process back into into something which helps you address those risks. And some of the addressing of those risks might be done through updating technology, but actually there are a whole range of ways that you can mitigate risk by changing process or even training. So it's not always that you need to update the underlying technology. There are creative ways of addressing risk as well. And so understanding that the evaluations that you're doing sit within the context of risk management. And particularly when we're focused on some of the elements of biometric risk, there are really three kind of key elements to the biometric risk. There's accuracy, which is where we're trying to make sure that a person isn't recognized as somebody else when that other person is not directly trying to attack the system. So for instance, if my brother accidentally was using my passport, then the system should have sufficient accuracy to be able to tell that we're not the same individual. Then there's vulnerability. Vulnerability sits under this broad term of presentation attack detection. And this is where the system might be vulnerable to people using masks or to a range of other different types of attacks that could potentially get into, where you have a dedicated attacker that is trying to penetrate your system. And underlying all of those from a biometric perspective is quality, because the quality of the biometric that you're collecting or the quality of the biometric acquisition directly affects both the accuracy and the vulnerability. And as we'll see later, during some of the red teaming can directly lead to attacks being successful where quality is not appropriately managed. So now I'm going to hand over to Stuart, who will take you through the connection between red teaming and standard ISO evaluation. Stuart.
Hi everyone. So as Ted mentioned, today I'm going to start, before we move on to the topic of red team testing for biometrics, we're going to take a few steps back and just look at the ISO 3107 standard for presentation attack detection testing, essentially. So I'm pleased to see that at this point in the industry we have a standard, the ISO 3107 standard for pad testing. And this really, the type of testing that is described and included in this standard provides a really good baseline that's really setting a good direction for the industry in terms of standardizing the way pad technology is tested, providing some amount of comparability between different platforms, different modalities for biometrics, etc. However, there are some challenges to applying this effectively. So some of the things that we tend to find with the application of the standard pad methodology, so what I'm really talking about here is this sort of, you might be familiar with like level-based testing, like a level 1, level 2, level A species or level B species. And we tend to find that these are relatively rigid methodologies that test a very specific single piece of technology for liveness, essentially, and that in doing that, there's maybe a small number of instruments that are tested. So a good example here would be the variety of technology. So a face system, for example, one provider may use blink detection, and another may use a head turn or some other mechanism for determining liveness. When you present an artifact to those two systems, they'll behave very differently based on the artifact, based on how you present it, environmental conditions, how you treat that artifact. And it does make the comparability of some of the performance a little bit challenging. So to do that, there is a modification to, a slight modification to some of the standards that need to be implemented in testing to really get a good sense of how something will perform against perhaps a single species like a photograph or a similar type of instrument, but presented in different ways and with different characteristics. So I'll talk a bit about that later. In applying this, however, there are of course some challenges to ascertain the robustness of this type of testing, and there are some validation and verification processes that sit over the top of that ensure that you can still get good outcomes of testing, but also still produce some of the things that are desirable, such as classification error rates and those sorts of statistics. So what you're looking at here is just a bit of a list of some of the things that we would see within a really holistic type evaluation. So this includes aspects of the system accuracy, aspects of quality, and aspects of vulnerability through different types of presentation attacks, essentially, much like that little triangle that you saw in the last slide and that Ted spoke about in terms of accuracy, quality, and vulnerability. And when you look at a level 1 or 2 type evaluation, which we do offer because it does meet some very specific purposes and is a really good thing for lots of vendors and products out there to have, there are some things that are not included within that type of evaluation that can still pose different types of risks. And to do that, a red team type exercise paints a much wider picture of the holistic risk posture of a whole system. So looking at things like workflows, including the accuracy in this type of evaluation, varying quality, as well as some other different types of exploits which may occur within the identity verification process as a whole, and not just the biometric sort of acquisition or liveness detection process. So now, moving on, we're going to discuss essentially red teaming and what that includes. So red teaming in its broadest form is really taking an adversarial position and applying sort of critical thinking to the whole identity verification process. And that's going to depend on the type of biometric product that you're talking about here. It may be a mobile app for bank onboarding. It might be access control. And both of these have a very different range of threats that need to be considered and you might include in a red team type exercise. And the types of activities that you might be looking to do here might not just be wearing a mask or doing a presentation attack. It may be exploiting different steps of the workflow through a presentation attack or a quality variation, systems that include where the enrollment's part of it, so things like documents may come into play as well. And there's a whole range of different things which you might include there. And where standardized testing returns are uniform metrics, so the attack presentation classification error rate, bona fide presentation classification error rate that's described in the 3107 PAD standard, red teaming can still produce those types of desirable metrics for comparison. However, you also get some very good unique outcomes in terms of different potential flaws or vulnerabilities that might exist within that. And I do also note here that although it's essential to understand red teaming and biometrics, it's also worth noting that this is one part of a full security initiative that might include cybersecurity aspects like penetration testing and red teaming of the wider IT system as well. So some of the inclusions within a red teaming type evaluation. So number one is biometric matching analysis. So this is a traditional type of evaluation that you might be familiar with. And this is closely coupled to the idea of quality. So you can see there around testing with different types of quality conditions, and it also can be bound with the PAD testing as well. BixeLab, part of our scope of accreditation, includes the ISO 19795 standard, and the testing through us can include a scenario evaluation as per that standard, and we would do that as part of our red teaming type exercise. Next is looking at the business processes and the workflow from a user perspective. So again, looking at the way that the whole identity workflow is implemented and different exploits that may present themselves along the way through that journey, whether it's in the mobile app, perhaps it's in a document that's presented if that's part of the process. Manual resolution processes as well can also present different types of risks. Next up is the vulnerability assessment. So this is again the 3107 standard included in BixeLab's scope of accreditation. And the important thing about the type of testing that we would do during a red teaming type exercise, it's not just simple level A or level 1 type artifact, simple, level 2 slightly more sophisticated. We use a range of different things from level 1 or level A through to level C or level 3, and testing with a diversity of types and diversity of species rather than just repeated examples of the same types of instruments. Another aspect here is around bias. So this might also be included in an aspect here. So this can also be a source of different types of vulnerability and risk that you can uncover during a red teaming exercise. So that might be testing with live subjects from different demographics, as well as creating particularly for a face type system, looking at different types of presentation attack instruments that are made based on different demographics. And then lastly, looking at some other aspects like non-functional requirements. So one of the big parts here might be transaction times. That can impact the types of attacks that are actually possible. The number of allowed attempts might also impact how a system performs and the different types of attacks that are possible. Because you might find on that initial analysis that there are certain types of attacks, depending on the system, which are simply are not going to be as effective in one use case as they may be in another. Some of the outcomes of performing red teaming type exercise, we divide this into three primary categories. So looking at a post-deployment risk assessment, so where a system is live and is ongoing and it's in production, taking testing from an offensive approach and doing that on a periodic basis allows testing of perhaps new types of presentation attacks, new types of vulnerabilities, which might have been uncovered over a period of time. Because when you do a typical pad test, it's performed at a point in time based on the currently available technology. So a good example here might be like a 3D printing technology that continues to improve, and you can create better and more effective artifacts as that technology develops. Next up is security assessment. So again, where a pad test looks at one narrow aspect of the overall identity system, providing a red teaming type exercise is a holistic security assessment that can look at different types of attacks that aren't just presentation attacks, and they're not just imposter style attacks. They might combine various techniques, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then lastly, around product maintenance. So providing this type of testing, we're looking at its customizable and targeted nature that's specific for the type of use case through which a system or a type of solution is deployed. And you can use, organizations can use this, organizations who are consumers of these products can take from this metrics, they can take from this a view of overall risk posture. And if you're a vendor providing this type of technology, you can use this as a basis for competitive advantage and making sure your product is in its best shape and configured appropriately with the right workflows, the right training under the hood, the right configurations, etc. And then inherently through doing a red teaming type exercise, we're also touching on aspects of usability here. So where we're looking at workflow, some of these might be security risks, but they can also be used to improve customer customer satisfaction to make a better workflow that provides better outcomes as well. So now moving on to some of the specific aspects of how we do testing and some of the things that are included here. And this is where we start talking about the different things that go into a red team type exercise versus a standard pad type test. So you can see three different images here along this this sort of flow chart that you can see that comes from the ISO 3107 standard. And you can see they're artificial type things. So this is really traditional presentation attacks. So masks, photographs, videos, those types of things. However, there's a couple of other things that are relevant here, which we include in our testing and is an important part of a red team type exercise on a biometric system. So this includes artificial type attacks that are partial. So this might be where a face is half covered, could be a half face mask like you see there, but it could also be something which just covers the eyes or different aspects there. And this allows, might permit cases where you can defeat liveness by maintaining some element of realism to the face, but also still providing a matching outcome that would result in a spoof. And then you also have, importantly, non-conformant type attacks. So we're really talking about quality here. And this is a big part of the attack optimization process of red teaming. So an example may be a certain type of presentation attack, which may be consistently detected. However, if you were to tweak the types of quality conditions that was presented in, you might get vastly different outcomes. And we'll describe that throughout our demonstration shortly. And in doing that, there's some means by which we might assess the different types of instruments that go beyond just just categorization of a species of presentation attack instrument. So this might be the creation process, so subtle differences in the creation process of that artifact. It might be for a paper mask, it may be different papers, different printers. These might produce subtle to our eyes, but in the context of a system can produce vastly different outcomes. Creation repeatability, so where we create artifacts that often on their first presentation, they're the most effective. And that may be because a system learns from that behavior, or it may be even through degradation of that. So a good example I like to use here is a fingerprint made from a piece of blue tack. It's quite a soft material, and on its first presentation, it'll look quite good. However, after a couple of presses down on the fingerprint sensor, it'll often flatten out and be far less effective. Preparation effort, so this is where we talk about the quality aspect, so how that artifact is presented is very important. And this might be where you have a different type of instrument. It may be what are you doing as the person doing the testing and holding or preparing the artifact? What are you doing to actively try and defeat the liveness? So taking a photograph, turning it sideways, waving your hand in front of it to try and simulate some movement and those types of things. And that can take an instrument that does not work at all, is consistently detected, to something which might consistently work. And then lastly is around the training and habituation of the people presenting these types of artifacts. Within the laboratory here, we've experienced with this type of testing, and we know the types of instruments and the types of techniques which might be more likely to prompt something to work. So a good example I like to use here again is with a photograph where a system is using blink detection, for example. If you were to wave your hand in front of the eyes across that photograph, in some cases on some blink detection systems, the momentary disappearance of the pupils can be enough to defeat liveness. And knowing that piece of information can again cause very different behavior from different types of presentation attack instruments. So what you're looking at here now is just some different examples of some of the types of things that we have within the laboratory. So there's some artifacts up the top there, so you can see different types of masks, full face, half face, and stretches across all different types of modalities as well. So we also have fake fingers from various materials, ocular prosthetics that we've used for testing iris systems, multispectral printers, so printing things in near infrared for systems that sort of work in that way, and digital instruments for displaying different types of artifacts like screens, iPads, different types of screens. And then importantly, the thing that's included in red team testing, and we feel is very important, is all the different types of quality factors. So to talk through this list, some of the things like population demographics, so the diversity of our test corpus, application factors, so the age of templates, time of day, those sorts of things. Physiology, we're really talking about sort of unchangeable characteristics of a person's appearance. This might be an eye color, or it might be scars on the fingers for a fingerprint. Behavior, so there's things like pose, expression, those sorts of things. Appearance, we generally here talk about changeable characteristics, so this might be someone wearing glasses, for example. We have environmental influences, so this might be backgrounds, lighting conditions, contrast, etc., shadows on the face. And then lastly, we have sensor and hardware, so different types of sensors and cameras. So, for example, the difference between the latest iPhone and a $100 Android phone on the selfie camera is going to be quite significant. And this is where we move on to talk about this interaction between quality and liveness. So what we say here is that where a system is willing to accept low quality samples, it's essentially more likely to be able to be spoofed, particularly where there are low quality enrollments. These create sources which are essentially more easy to spoof. And where an attacker has access to high quality and unaltered samples, these represent a significant threat for creating artifacts essentially. And where there are low quality or tampered samples, these can degrade the attack value in this type of context. So a system that has extreme quality variations is essentially more likely to have successful spoof performed against it. And where we look at the attack optimization is where we combine different types of presentation attacks and other vulnerabilities, and looking at the different quality aspects that might be particularly relevant for a certain type of system. So some of the things here you can see, is different types of instruments, so a microsil, a blue tack, and a silicon fingerprint, and they're presented in different ways. And you can see they're looking very different and might produce different types of behavior. So the blue tack one looks very good, it looks very good there, but then it can be quite, smushed out and things like that when you present it on, its third attempt, for example. So a key part of entering the red teaming type exercise is this talking about the optimization of attacks. And what we're doing here is we're looking to find the optimal values or parameters which can produce different types of behavior based on a single type of presentation attack instrument. So we might take, like you see there, like a paper type mask, but we look at different presentation mediums. So what happens if we use a different type of paper? What happens if we use a different type of ink? And then we move on to the presentation format. So manipulating the media or environment that may aid spoofing. What if we take that mask and we curl it a little bit? What if we put a person behind the mask or different people? What if we change the lighting? What if we use a real person's head to make a head turn to introduce some kind of movement? So you can see there how one particular type of instrument can be presented in a whole number of different ways that might produce different behaviors from the system. And then lastly, talking about subject diversity, so different types of bias is what we might be talking about here. And we often talk about bias in the context of accuracy. However, bias is also extremely relevant for presentation attack detection. So a good example I like to use here is that in certain types of systems, like a face system, a full face silicon type mask, it's much easier to create a convincing example of an older white male than it might be of other types of demographics. And the reason I mention this is that the PAD standard, the ISO 3107 standard, does not really talk extensively about environmental variables and means by presenting presentation attacks. It just really talks about different types of species. But our testing has consistently shown that different conditions and optimization of attacks can produce very different behaviors for one type of presentation attack species. And then lastly is on the topic of non-biometric attack vectors. So it's one thing to look at accuracy aspects, and it's one thing to look at presentation attack aspects, combining those together. However, there's some other non-biometric attack vectors that might sit here. So simple type cyber attacks, they might do things like substituting templates within a system may be possible, modifying thresholds for false accept rates, etc., to falsely accept images that would not otherwise be accepted. And the two others that are really important here can be quite unique to behaviors to biometric systems is document fraud can be one thing. So fraudulently obtained genuine documents can be very hard to detect. But there's also things like forged documents and use of other people's documents. And this is particularly relevant for a lot of the testing that we do for EIDV solutions. For those that don't know, these are the types of solutions that you may have used for a bank onboarding, where you take a photograph of a document and you take a selfie. And what we've found in those types of cases is they're often tested for presentation attack detection. How what we find is that the biggest threat is often the document itself, because that's the source of the biometric, and it can be easier to get a convincing looking forged document for the purposes of this type of solution than it is to conduct a successful presentation attack. And then lastly is on the topic of threat agents. So again, on these types of solutions, manual resolution components might be relevant depending on the type of system, and these might be operators who are resolving documents, they're doing facial image comparison, and the training that those operators are equipped with can become relevant as well and a source of attack. So now moving on, I have my laboratory manager, Soumya here, who's going to provide a demonstration of some attack optimization. So you can see through that type of demonstration how you can have one type of species, a level A, or one type of instrument, but you can see the wide range of things that might exist within that one type of instrument. So something's a photograph, but something might be low quality, it might be high quality, and you can present that in a number of different ways. And that really reflects on the outcomes that you see on this slide here. So these are some outputs from this type of app. And what it has is a face verification, so a match score essentially. We have a liveness score where higher is essentially better. We have a quality score as well, where again higher is reflects different outcomes. So this is looking at quality variation. So we have presented one type of instrument with 4 different types of quality around the blur, high, exposure, etc. And you can see here in this particular example, we got the best score from a high exposure setting. So with that piece of knowledge, we can essentially move forward and determine the other aspects of the test. So now, again, we look at these, then now we have one particular instrument. Well, what if we take that instrument presented in different ways? So we have the photograph presented flat, we have it presented in a convex fashion, and then in a concave fashion as well. And that again has different impacts on the verification, on the accuracy essentially, the liveness, and the quality. And we can use this information again to have a look at the different types of things that might promote different behaviors from the system. And then we can again do that here, and now we can combine these different types of techniques. So what if we take the example from the first one? So we had the high quality photo for instance, and we might present that concave. So different types of combinations of quality conditions, formats and presentations can produce very different behaviors. And that's what we're trying to get at here. And what we arrive at is essentially an optimized attack where we have one instrument, but it's presented in the most effective way that's most likely to spoof the system. So now, in terms of what BixeLab provides in this sense, so we have our level R testing methodology. This is a testing methodology which, through our accreditation process, is a validated and verified and proven testing methodology, which provides an end-to-end holistic view of performance against different types of presentation attacks, as well as quality variation, accuracy, and other aspects that we've discussed, including in a red team type exercise. And this level R testing methodology includes the tailoring of a test strategy to the specific system under test. So this comes into where I talk about things like the use case, whether it's a mobile app or an access control. We'll select a very different type of presentation attack instruments or quality conditions, for example, depending on the use case, rather than just applying them universally, regardless of what the use case the end use case of that product actually is. It includes a 19795 compliance scenario evaluation. So this is where we look at those accuracy aspects, but also including quality. We have a presentation attack detection evaluation as per the 3107 standard, again, within our scope of accreditation and providing the associated outcomes there, including all relevant metrics. Issuing of a test report that includes both of those standards. And lastly, the issue of the BixeLab statement of conformity against our testing methodology and the approach that we've taken. And lastly, I'll quickly comment on the topic of personally identifiable information. This is a very important topic for us, and it's of particular relevance for biometric testing, because there is a certain amount of personal data which is exchanged in this type of process. We have a policy and procedure for the management of privacy, and through our accreditation process, one of the requirements there has been that that approach, that policy and procedure for privacy management has been validated and approved by the Australian National Health and Medical Research Council, and we're happy to take any questions that you might have on the BixeLab management of PII. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Ted, who's going to provide a quick summary talking about our testing overview and methodology. Thanks, Ted.
Thanks, Stuart, and thanks, Tomya. So yes, we're almost at the end of the presentation now, so please, if you've got questions, feel free to put them in now, and we'll look forward to having a good discussion at the end. So just to finish, I think it's good to explain a little bit about the testing process itself. So when we are engaged to do a red teaming exercise, we start out by constructing a test methodology. And that test methodology obviously is based on standards and frameworks that we have, but because every solution is different, it's important to be able to customize that test methodology to be able to extract what's going to be the most important aspects. And so we do that by having some workshops with clients to make sure that the testing methodology is agreed and settled before this testing begins. Then we start the testing itself, and basically that testing process is done in the formalized lab setting, but importantly it involves this feedback loop where we can continue to use the knowledge that we have about the system to improve and look at the different attack instruments. And finally, we have a test report where we are able to provide a comprehensive analysis of all of the issues that we found and issue a compliance certificate as appropriate. It's very important to us. We're very focused on making sure that the results from this process are very relevant and useful to the clients that we have. And so it's not just about delivering a final report, it's also about making sure that there's a good understanding of the implications of the things that have been uncovered, and where practical, also some suggestions about what sorts of things might be done to mitigate those vulnerabilities. And my final slide is just to mention, second to last slide is to mention just the other services that BixeLab provides very quickly around analysis of biometric data. Obviously we have biometric data sets, or you've got issues that need to be examined within an operational biometric system. We have a long history of being able to work with clients all around the world to be able to do that type of analysis, either in an ad hoc fashion or periodically. We also provide can provide cyber and data services in terms of helping both look at cyber threats and providing advice around how to store and manage biometric data securely. We provide training services, and we will be delivering some of that training, some new training services in the next few months, which we will let people know about. There's a lot of work that's going on around the world in governance and identity frameworks, and we are experts in that particular area and can provide both advice in the framing of those frameworks as well as in the assessment of technology for compliance with identity frameworks. And finally, audit and reporting. If you have an operational biometric system, you definitely should be making sure that you've got the right outputs that are coming out of that system, and that you can have some way of regularly auditing to make sure that your system continues to perform at the level that you expect it to. We have a few different exciting things which are happening within BixeLab. In the next sort of quarter, we will be delivering some online biometric training courses. We will also expect to have the first formal pad evaluation of a speaker verification system, which is very exciting, and a white paper on governance in biometric systems, very relevant for those identity frameworks we just mentioned. A lot of work we do at the moment relates to EIDB testing, and we do that in compliance with the various standards that we have, but there are gaps in those standards, and we have our own methodology which helps bridge those gaps, and we'll be looking to do a very topical workshop in Q3 as well. And then Q4 will be a continuation of those things, particularly talking with a focus on bias, which is, of course, a very important aspect of biometric assessment at the moment, and a final workshop in that quarter. So that brings us to the conclusion of the workshop. Thank you so much for staying with us for the duration of this time. We have a few minutes now for any questions or comments, and yeah, we'd be delighted to be able to answer anything that you might have. Whilst we're whilst we are waiting for any further comments, I might just ask Stuart. Stuart, could you say a few words maybe about the connection between the testing and assurance and then the identity frameworks?
Yeah, absolutely. So some of the testing that we provide against, again, within our scope of accreditation, we're talking about the 19795 standard and the 3107 standard for PAD testing. And these are particularly relevant now with the topic of national identity framework. So in Australia, we have the Trusted Digital Identity Framework, or TDIF. And one of the key requirements of that framework is essentially that systems are well risk managed, and that includes a PAD evaluation at a minimum PAD level 1 against the 3107 standard. So very, very relevant, and for organisations to participate in the national identity scheme, that they're going to need to have their system tested at least to that standard.
So yes, we've got some questions there, and the first question relates to whether it's focused on the verification authentication rather than onboarding or enrollment artifacts, and actually that's kind of relevant to the conversation that we were just having.
Yeah.
Stuart, do you want to just expand on that?
So just looking at that type of one, so some of the onboarding attacks, what Sonia described in that demonstration with the document, when we do testing, particularly on eIDV solutions, increasingly we find we actually often tend to do less biometric testing and more general testing with things like that. So we might find when we test eIDV solutions, a very large portion of that looks at that onboarding process and looking at different types of documents. So rather than performing a complicated and potentially expensive presentation attack, as a vulnerability, it might be much easier to photocopy a passport, substitute the photo, and do those sorts of things. So really, depending on the type of testing, the vulnerabilities of the process can be more important than the technology itself. A big part of what we do.
Yep. The next question is looking at 4 or 8K video presentation attacks. As Sonia was mentioning, we use a range of different attack vectors, and certainly higher resolution video presentation attacks are part of that process that we do test for. Because as you kind of imply there, the higher resolution the display, the harder it is for a camera sensor, for instance, to be able to tell the difference between something which is on a monitor versus something which is being captured in real life. And so you correctly identify that that's a key aspect, is the quality of the artifact which is being used. And then Stuart, do you want to answer the next question, which is related to PII?
So this is around where we're looking at different types of bias. So we've done this type of testing, and it really depends on the format through which the testing will be done. So if we're looking for bias, we can do that type of testing by you providing us the technology here, and we source our own data. However, we've also done this type of testing by receiving de-identified data from you, and that might be like you say there, like genders and age and ethnicity. We don't necessarily need the underlying data to do that type of analysis, and we're happy to discuss with you around. We're very flexible in the approach, and there's lots of different ways that we can do this type of testing, whether it's you providing us the technology, you providing us data, or the other way around as well to manage privacy.
Yeah. So before we close, thanks for your questions. For those that just asked questions, feel free to give a follow-up. Let us know if you feel that we've answered your questions to what you were hoping in your question. But I would just say again, please stay in touch. Feel free to reach out to us directly on our email to ask questions, or indeed to set up a time so we can talk in more detail about what sorts of testing services and how we conduct our services. Thank you very much. I hope you all have a good night or a good day, and I'll be looking forward to being in touch with all of you one way or another in the next few months. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.